BBC Radio Suffolk.
Next this morning, though, losing somebody is never easy. It's something that we all sadly will go through at some point in our lives, but losing a partner can be one of the hardest things, I think, in a person's lifetime. I'm joined now by, and I hate this term, widow from Suffolk, who's trying to encourage people in her position to share their experiences in order to help and try and combat grief a little bit. Now, Lucinda Boast is from Felixstowe and is the co-founder of the Widowed AF podcast, and she joins me in the studio now. Morning, Lucinda.
Morning, Wayne. Thank you for having me.
I hate that term. I don't know why I hate the term Suffolk widow. I just don't like it.
It still jars with me too, the word. I get sick of the sound of it.
When you hear the word widow, and I said this to you whilst that song was playing, I was expecting a woman in her 60s or 70s or 80s to walk into the studio.
Absolutely, with a black veil and all that kind of stuff, yeah.
And I would imagine that that's something you've experienced, people, when we use that word widow.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
That's what springs to mind. Before we chat about the podcast, let's find out a little bit about your stories. So you lost your partner back in 2016. Can you tell us what happened, how old he was?
John was 40. He went to work telling me that he was going on to a training course, which ended up being a lie, basically. He was visiting another woman and he died of a cardiac arrest, and it wasn't until 6 weeks later that I found out he'd had heroin in his body, which I'll never know how it got there. John wasn't a drug user. He didn't even smoke or drink that much, so it's a mystery, really.
My goodness. So...
Sorry, Wayne, that's a bit of a shocker for you.
He died while seeing this other woman?
Yes. Yeah, she was paid for.
Right.
And he'd visited her 4 times in the year leading up to his death.
Ooh.
And I had no idea.
When you found out what had happened and where he was, you got the shock of losing him. How long had you been married?
We'd been married at that point for 4 years. We'd been together for 8 years.
And you just had a baby, hadn't you?
Yes, she was 18 months old.
So you lose the father of your child and the love of your life, and then you find out that he was with another woman when he died. Can you begin to explain how you felt?
I just went into anger mode, and I don't think the anger has ever disappeared. It's always underneath the surface. It's deeper now. But in those early days, I was a very angry person. Even at the funeral, I couldn't even bring myself to stand up and talk about him because I hated him with such a rage. But it was a sadness as well, because all of the memories that we created suddenly felt void and like they didn't count. And I felt sad for my daughter. You know, she had barely even had the chance to build a bond with her dad, and now he was gone.
Were there times in those first few days where you ever thought he got what he deserved?
Yes. Yeah. At one point, I think I even said the words, if he was alive now, I'd kill him myself. You know, I was just so angry.
I am shocked. I was shocked when I heard that. I didn't know that part of the story.
Yeah, it's extremely shocking. And
but he was still the man you married and the man you loved, and he's the father of your daughter. This was 6-7 years ago now. After those initial weeks and maybe even months following John's death, did it get easier and did you regain that love for him?
It got easier eventually, but to begin with, it got harder because there were more discoveries that I made. This woman wasn't the only one. There were lots more, and it had happened throughout our 8-year relationship. John wasn't a secretive person, I thought. He was very open with, you know, for example, his phone. We weren't the type to go through each other's phones or anything like that. But if I needed to use his phone, he'd just hand it to me. It didn't have a password on it. So all of these things were there for me to find, but I never went looking for them. And in the weeks after John's death, I went looking. I wanted all of the information. I wanted, everything the police had to tell me. And I felt like they were drip feeding me information. So, yeah, for a while, I felt worse. And around the 2-year mark, I was probably at my worst point. By that point, I'd developed post-traumatic stress disorder. It had taken over my life. I was getting flashbacks from passages of the post-mortem report, which I'd chosen to read for some reason. And yeah, that was the worst point. And from then on, it started slowly getting better.
It's a story that I don't know how you've coped with this. You think you marry someone, you think you know them, you clearly didn't. There were lots of secrets, and the heroin, we never got to the bottom of that.
No, never. John was really anti-drugs. I went back. I approached some of his childhood friends and the people that he'd hung about with in his teens, and he was always the designated driver, and they were the ones using drugs and messing about. And John, felt negatively about drugs. So I still don't believe in my heart that he chose to take them.
Did you not suspect anything?
His behaviour had changed in the year leading up to his death, but I put it down to the fact that we had a newborn baby and we had a new business, which it's John's dream to run. He was a mechanic. It was his dream to run his own garage. So I'd supported him to do that. And that was stressful for him. So I put it down to stress. And he worked long hours. He found reasons to be away from the house. He didn't seem to like being at home. He started picking arguments with me for no reason. Which really confused me because we'd never had a cross word before that.
Yeah. So prior to that, you had a normal, healthy marriage in all departments?
We were so happy in our little bubble, the two of us.
Listen, your experiences of grief are going to be completely different to another's experience of grief. I suppose behind everyone, there's a story.
Yeah.
You've launched this podcast. Why did you feel the need to do this?
Rosie Gilmoss, my co-presenter, and I, we became friends in 2019 and bonded over our shared loss and our experience. And we felt we weren't being represented, really. The idea that you described, Wayne, about widows, just wasn't representative of us. We were continuing our life. We lost our partner, but we were still alive, and we wanted to be happy again. So the idea for the podcast started probably over a year ago, and it started in the form of Rosie wanting to write a book about her experience, and exploring all the different stories that there are that we've learned from our widow friends. And eventually in September she rang me and said, why don't we make a podcast? We love podcasts. We get, so much advice and guidance from listening to them ourselves. Why don't we create one for widows? So that's what we decided to do.
Have you told your story on the podcast yet?
Yes. Rosie interviewed me a couple of days ago, and that's been released now. So, yeah.
It's really interesting because this is about how to cope with grief. And let's just go back to your case very, very quickly, then I do want to talk more about the podcast. But in your situation, I would imagine when people hear your story, their attitude towards you will be a little bit different because they will probably say things like, you're better off without him. I bet people have more grief for what you found out about him than him actually being dead.
It's so true.
Is that fair to say?
Yes. And even just telling my story face to face to someone makes them uncomfortable because it's unpalatable. It's unpleasant to hear. And there were lots of people who just simply couldn't believe what John had done. Also, they'd question our relationship. And, even if they didn't do it out loud, I knew that people were thinking, she must have known. There must have been signs. I'd have picked it up. So, yeah, it's always been difficult to tell my story.
Is it the second episode of the podcast you're up to? Do you hope to address different forms of loss, different forms of grief? Is that the whole point of the podcast?
Absolutely. Our theme is that every widow has a story, and all the stories are so different. Rosie, for instance, who I interviewed yesterday, her husband was lost to the sea. He went on a scuba diving trip and never returned. So we're going to be exploring her story. She's married to another widow now. We're going to be exploring his story. He lost his wife to bowel cancer. So yeah, we've had over 25 applications now from all kinds of people who really want to tell their story, which is so encouraging.
I think as this podcast grows and the episodes grow, this is going to be a listen point where whatever anyone's gone through, there'll be a relatable story somewhere on your podcast.
Oh, absolutely. Even if, we strongly encourage people who haven't gone through this experience to listen, because there's a takeaway for everybody there. If you're supported, everyone knows someone who's lost someone. And our stories, I really hope, will encourage people and give them hope.
How's your little girl, Lulu? She's 8 years old now.
Oh gosh, Scarlett is nearly 8, and she is full of personality, and it's really interesting because everyone says she looks just like me, and she does, but certain facial expressions that she pulls are 100% her dad, and it's hilarious. And then sometimes I'll think, God, you're just like your dad, and it's annoying, And I think she's probably like John was as a kid. John's mum described him as a swine growing up. And
really?
Yeah. Full of personality, mischief, trouble, never sat still. And that's our daughter.
The podcast is out now. Where can people find it?
You can find it on Spotify. It's on all the major platforms, anywhere where you take your podcast, basically.
It's called Widowed AF. I won't say what the abbreviations mean. Are you still looking for people to come forward to take part in future podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a story to tell, then please visit our website, which is www.widowedaf.com. There's a form on there where you can click and fill out your information to apply to be interviewed.
Well, I hope it's a huge success, and I'm sure it will be. Do you think you'll ever find it in your heart to be able to trust anybody again when it comes to affairs of the heart?
I really don't know, Wayne. I mean, I'm still single. I've been single throughout the last 6.5 years, and I'm happy now. So I don't think I want to change that.
Listen, thanks for being honest and telling us your story. As you say, when you tell people, you get similar reactions, don't you?
You do.
It's very brave of you. That podcast is Widowed AF. Do have a listen. They're on up to episode 2. And the feedback they're getting at the moment is great. If you'd like to take part in it yourself with your experience of grief, you can contact them as well. Is there an email?
There is. You can email me, which is Lulu, Lulu, @widowedaf.com.
Lovely. Thank you for coming in, Lucinda.
Thank you so much for having me.
Been nice chatting. It's 11:32 now, BBC Radio Suffolk.